Hello again. I'm William Crawford. You've heard me talk about the Red Ball Express, how we drove 72 hours straight to keep Patton's army rolling, how 23,000 black drivers delivered 400,000 tons of supplies and won the war at 35 miles per hour. But today I need to tell you what happened next. What happened when all that fuel we delivered, all those millions of gallons we hauled through exhaustion and artillery fire, met the German army head on. I need to tell you about the Battle of the Bulge, about the day I watched the most powerful tanks in the world stop dead in the snow. Not because we shot them, not because we bombed them, because they ran out of gas. And I need to tell you what we did with our gas. We burned it, millions of gallons, set it on fire rather than let the Germans have it. That's when I understood what we really were, not just truck drivers, not just support troops. We were the reason Germany lost the war. Let me take you back. December 1944. I was still driving Red Ball routes, though the operation had officially ended a month earlier. They kept some of us running supplies because the war wasn't over yet. The Germans were beaten. Everybody knew that, but they weren't surrendering. We were stationed near the Belgian border, cold as hell, snow everywhere, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and doesn't leave until spring. On December 16th, everything changed. The Germans launched their last big offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, they called it. We called it the Battle of the Bulge because of how their attack pushed a bulge into our lines. Hitler threw everything he had left at us. His best SS divisions, his Tiger tanks, those massive 60-ton monsters that could destroy a Sherman from a mile away. His most fanatical soldiers, the ones who still believed they could win. And they almost broke through. Almost. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The German attack wasn't stopped by American courage alone. It was stopped by something simpler than that. They ran out of gas. I found out later what happened on the German side. There was an SS colonel named Joachim Peiper, one of their best tank commanders, holder of all kinds of medals, the tip of the German spear. Peiper's battle group had over 100 tanks, Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, the most powerful armored force Germany could assemble. His mission was to race through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. There was just one problem. They gave him 31,000 gallons of fuel. The distance to his objective was 65 miles. His tanks burned 2.5 gallons per mile. Do the math. He didn't have enough fuel to get there, not even close. The German High Command knew this. Their plan, their actual military plan, was to capture American fuel depots along the way. They were betting their entire offensive on stealing our gas. Think about that for a minute. The mighty German army, the Wehrmacht, that had conquered Europe was reduced to hoping they could steal enough fuel from us to keep their tanks running. That's not a military strategy. That's desperation. On December 17th, Peiper's forces captured an American fuel depot at a place called Hansfeld. It was a small depot, what we called a Class 3B station, just a forward supply point. But to the Germans, it was a miracle. 50,000 gallons, stacked in jerry cans, row after row, stretching for 200 meters. The Americans had retreated so fast they'd left fires still burning in oil drums, coffee still hot in the cups. I heard about this later from a sergeant who'd been stationed there. He said the Germans stood among those fuel cans like they'd found gold, like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And you know what? They couldn't. Because 50,000 gallons, which seemed like a fortune to them, was nothing to us. That was less than we delivered in a single Red Ball convoy, less than the trucks burned in 3 hours of operation, a rounding error in our daily consumption. But to Peiper's men, it was enough fuel to keep moving, so they filled their tanks with American gasoline and pushed forward. That's when they learned the truth about American abundance. That same day, Peiper's forces approached another depot, a bigger one, Stavelot. This depot held over 2 million gallons of fuel, enough to power Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back, enough to potentially change the outcome of the offensive. I knew men who were stationed at Stavelot, engineers from the 291st Combat Battalion. When they got word the Germans were coming, they had a decision to make. They couldn't hold the depot, didn't have enough men, enough guns. The German tanks would roll right over them. So they did something the Germans never expected. They burned it. Captain John Brewster gave the order. His men poured gasoline trails between the stacks of jerry cans. They distributed white phosphorus grenades, and at 4:30 in the afternoon, with German tanks approaching, they set 2 million gallons of fuel on fire. The explosion was massive, a wall of flame 100 feet high, black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the sky. The fire would burn for 3 days. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find nothing but an inferno. And here's what kills me. Here's what I think about when I can't sleep at night. We burned more fuel in that one decision, 2 million gallons, than Germany had allocated for their entire offensive. We destroyed it rather than let them have it, because we could afford to, because we had so much more where that came from. One of Peiper's men, a driver named Weber, later described what happened when they saw Stavelot burning. He said Peiper climbed up on his tank turret and watched the flames for 5 minutes without saying a word. Just stood there watching 2 million gallons turn to smoke. Then he climbed down and said to his men, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" That's when they knew. That's the moment the German army understood they were already dead. They just hadn't fallen down yet. Because it wasn't just Stavelot. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps rather than risk capture. At Thou, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons destroyed. In the first week alone, Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel. 8 million gallons. More than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. Burned on purpose, because we had so much we could afford to waste it. I was driving a supply run on December 19th when I saw my first abandoned German tank. It was a Panther. Beautiful machine, if you can call a weapon beautiful. Sleek, powerful, one of the best tanks in the world. Just sitting there in a field, turret pointed toward the American lines. My convoy stopped to check if it was a trap. Some of the boys approached carefully, rifles ready. Turned out there was nobody inside. The Germans had abandoned it. The fuel gauge was empty. Over the next few days, I saw more and more of them. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, armored vehicles worth millions of dollars just sitting in fields and ditches and roadsides. Empty fuel tanks, everyone. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. The German army, Hitler's mighty Wehrmacht, defeated by empty gas tanks. A sergeant from the 30th Infantry Division told me they'd captured a German officer who couldn't believe what was happening. The officer kept saying, "You Americans waste more fuel warming your coffee than we have for our tanks. How is this possible?" We didn't have a good answer for him. We'd never thought about it. We had fuel. We had more fuel than we could use. The idea of running out was as foreign to us as the idea of having enough was to them. Here's what I learned about the numbers later, the numbers that explain everything. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany, including all their synthetic production and the Romanian oil fields they'd captured, produced 33 million barrels. We produced 50 times more oil than they did. Every day, American forces in Europe consumed 7.5 million gallons of fuel. Every day, we received 8.2 million gallons. We were building reserves while fighting a war. The Germans couldn't replace what they lost. We couldn't use up what we had. That's not a war. That's an execution. By December 21st, Peiper's battle group was surrounded at a place called La Glaise, the most powerful German armored force in the Ardennes. The tip of Hitler's last offensive was sitting in a Belgian village with empty fuel tanks. The American forces surrounding him, 31st Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, 3rd Armored, had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for that day alone. Peiper had maybe 1,000 gallons left. I heard a captain joking about it at a supply depot. He said, "We use more fuel heating our coffee than those Germans have for their tanks." It wasn't really a joke. It was the truth. On the night of December 23rd, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that had started the offensive, 39 were still operational. They weren't damaged. They weren't out of ammunition. They just had no fuel, so the Germans destroyed their own tanks with their remaining ammunition and walked through the snow to captivity, millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment. The best tanks Germany had ever built, destroyed by empty fuel tanks. I drove past Le Glaise a few weeks later after everything had been secured. The German tanks were still there. Nobody had moved them yet, just sitting in the snow like metal statues. I stopped my truck and walked over to one of them, a Tiger tank, massive thing, bigger than anything we had. The armor was inches thick. The gun could have killed any American tank from a mile away, and it was dead, frozen, useless, because it had no gas. I climbed up on the hull and looked inside. The fuel gauge read empty. The crew had left personal items behind, photographs, letters from home. They'd had to abandon everything and walk. I sat there for a long time thinking about what it meant. Here was the most powerful tank in the world, the weapon that was supposed to win the war for Hitler, the pride of German engineering, and I had helped kill it, not with a gun or a bomb, with a truck, with all those convoys I'd driven, all those gallons I'd delivered, all those nights I'd spent hallucinating from Benzedrine while hauling fuel across France. The Red Ball Express had put fuel in American tanks and taken it away from German ones. We'd created the abundance that let us burn 2 million gallons at Stavelot while they scraped for every drop. We hadn't just supported the victory. We had made it inevitable. The German prisoners were the ones who really showed me what we'd done. After the Bulge collapsed, we processed thousands of them. They came through our lines cold, hungry, defeated. A lot of them couldn't believe what they were seeing. One German officer, I remember this clearly, was being marched past our motor pool, hundreds of trucks, fuel tankers, jerry cans stacked everywhere. He stopped walking and just stared. The MP escorting him had to push him to keep moving. Later I heard what he'd said. "You have more fuel in this one depot than my entire division received for the offensive. How can we fight this? How can anyone fight this?" Another prisoner, a sergeant, watched us throwing away half-eaten rations. He started crying, actually crying. "My men haven't eaten chocolate in 2 years, he said. "You feed it to your dogs. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight infinity?" That word stuck with me. Infinity. That's what we must have looked like to them, an infinite supply of everything they lacked. I talked to a German tanker once, young kid, maybe 19 or 20. He'd been in one of Peiper's Panthers before it ran out of fuel. He told me about the moment they found the depot at Hansfeld, 50,000 gallons of American fuel just sitting there. He said they celebrated like they'd won the lottery. Then he told me about watching Stavelot burn, 2 million gallons going up in smoke. "That's when we knew," he said. "You captured what seemed like everything to us, and you burned it, because you had so much more, because our everything was your nothing." He asked me how it was possible. How could America have so much? I didn't have a good answer. I'd grown up poor in Alabama. My family had never had much of anything. But compared to what Germany had in 1944, we were all rich beyond measure. I just sort of told him the truth. We have a lot of oil, a lot of factories, a lot of trucks, and a lot of men willing to drive them. He nodded, like that explained something. Then he said, "We had courage, we had training, we had the best tanks in the world, but you had oil. In the end, oil wins." Oil wins. I've never forgotten that. After the war, I learned more about what we'd really accomplished, what the Red Ball Express and all the logistics operations had really meant. The Germans had allocated 5 million gallons of fuel for the entire Ardennes offensive. We destroyed 8 million gallons just to keep them from getting it. We burned more than they had. Think about that. We wasted more than they started with, and we still had plenty left over. The German army was like a man trying to cross a desert with a canteen. The American army was like a man crossing the same desert with a fire hose connected to the ocean. We couldn't run out if we tried. Field Marshal Keitel, when he signed the German surrender, was asked what most surprised him about the American forces. He said, "Your trucks, your fuel." The Red Ball Express showed us that you had militarized your entire society's production capacity. We were fighting your factories, not just your soldiers, and your factories never ran dry. That's what we were, not just drivers. We were the connection between American factories and American victory. Every gallon we delivered was a gallon that moved our tanks forward and left German tanks sitting empty in the snow. I keep thinking about Joachim Peiper standing on his tank, watching Stavelot burn, 2 million gallons going up in flames. He was one of the best tank commanders in the German army. Brave, skilled, decorated. His men would have followed him anywhere, and none of it mattered, because his tanks were empty. All his courage, all his training, all his experience, it was worthless without fuel. And we had made sure he wouldn't get any, not with guns, with trucks. The German army wasn't defeated by the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, though they fought like heroes. It wasn't defeated by Patton's 3rd Army racing north, though they moved faster than anyone thought possible. It was defeated by the drivers of the Red Ball Express, by the men who built the pipelines, by the ships that crossed the Atlantic carrying fuel, by the refineries in Texas and California and Pennsylvania that never stopped pumping. It was defeated by logistics, by abundance, by industrial might. And 75% of the men who delivered that abundance were black. That's what I want you to understand. What I need you to understand. They tell you war is about courage and sacrifice and heroism, and it is. But in modern war, industrial war, it's also about production, about supply lines, about who has more of everything. The Germans had courage, they had sacrifice, they had some of the most dedicated soldiers in history. We had oil, we had factories, we had 23,000 truck drivers who hadn't slept in 3 days. Courage didn't fill their fuel tanks, production filled ours. When Peiper's Panthers sat empty in the snow, it wasn't because his men weren't brave enough. It was because we delivered more fuel in a single day than his entire battle group had for the whole offensive. When the Tiger tanks at La Glaise were abandoned with full ammunition but empty gas tanks, it wasn't because the German tankers were cowards. It was because we'd burned 8 million gallons rather than let them have a single drop. That's how wars are won now. Not by who's braver, but by who has more. And we had more of everything. I went back to Belgium in 1984, 40 years after the battle. They had a reunion for veterans of the Bulge at La Glaise. The museum there has Peiper's Tiger tank, still sitting where it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Fuel gauge empty. A monument to what happens when tactics meet logistics and logistics wins. I stood next to that tank for a long time, 60 years old then walked with a cane, but I made myself stand there. A German veteran was there too, old man, same as me. He'd been a driver in Peiper's battle group. We got to talking. We always wondered why you stopped, I told him. We thought it was tactical. He laughed, not a happy laugh, bitter. We stopped because tanks were empty, he said. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that? I thought about all those nights on the Red Ball Express, all those hours without sleep, all those miles through artillery fire and exhaustion and fear. We never knew you were that short, I said. We had so much we never thought about it. He nodded. That was the war. You measured in millions, we measured in liters. The outcome was decided before we fired a shot. We stood there together for a while, 2 old men who'd been on opposite sides of the same war. Then he shook my hand and said something I'll never forget. You truck drivers, he said, you defeated us more than any general. Patton got the glory, you delivered the victory. He was right. We did. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, his final attempt to turn the war around. And it failed because his tanks ran out of gas, not because of brilliant American tactics, not because of superior American courage, because of superior American production, because of oil wells in Texas and refineries in California, because of Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, because of pipelines under the English Channel, because of 6,000 trucks on the Red Ball Express driven by men who hadn't slept in days, delivering 12,000 tons of supplies every 24 hours, because of us, the logistics troops, the support personnel, the ones they said weren't real soldiers. We won that war. We won it with trucks and fuel and an industrial machine that could waste more than Germany possessed. Peiper's Tigers were the finest tanks in the world. Didn't matter if they sat empty in Belgian snow. While we drove past with trucks full of gasoline, that's what modern war is. Not about who's braver, about who has more. And we had more of everything. I'm 91 years old now. Most of the men I served with are gone. Most of the Germans we fought are gone too. But the lesson remains. The lesson I learned watching those beautiful German tanks sit useless in the snow. Production wins wars. Logistics wins wars. The side that can supply its armies will defeat the side that can't, no matter how brave the other side's soldiers are. The Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies in 82 days. The German army couldn't have moved that much in a year. We burned 8 million gallons of fuel rather than let the enemy have it. The Germans couldn't produce 8 million gallons in 6 months. That's not a contest. That's a foregone conclusion, and 75% of the men who made it happen were black, segregated, discriminated against, told we weren't good enough for combat. We weren't good enough to fight, but we were good enough to win. We weren't allowed to carry rifles, but we carried something more important, the fuel that made everything else possible. Without us, Patton doesn't move. Without us, the Bulge doesn't get stopped. Without us, those German tanks keep rolling instead of sitting empty in the snow. We won that war. The truck drivers, the fuel handlers, the men they left out of the history books. And now you know. I keep a picture on my wall. It's not from the war, it's from that reunion in 1984, me standing next to Peiper's Tiger tank at L'Église. My grandson asked me once why I kept that picture, why I wanted to remember a German tank. I told him, that tank represents everything we accomplished, the most powerful weapon Germany ever built, and we defeated it without firing a shot. We defeated it with trucks and fuel and logistics. We defeated it by being so abundant they couldn't compete. He thought about that for a minute. Then he said, "So you won the war by having more stuff?" I laughed. That's exactly right. We had more stuff, and that's why we won. It sounds simple when you say it that way, but it wasn't simple. It was 23,000 men driving through exhaustion. It was hundreds of ships crossing the Atlantic. It was millions of workers in factories back home. It was an entire nation mobilized for production. The German soldier was brave, skilled, dedicated. None of it mattered because his tanks were empty. Our soldiers were brave too, but they never had to wonder if there'd be fuel tomorrow. They never had to measure by the liter. They never had to abandon their tanks and walk through the snow because there was nothing left to burn. We gave them abundance, and abundance wins wars. So this is my story. I want to thank this channel and the entire team for hearing me, for giving me the opportunity to finally speak my truth after all these years. I hope you share this with the young people in your life. I want them to understand that wars aren't just won by soldiers with guns. They're won by workers in factories, by drivers in trucks, by everyone who keeps the supply lines moving. I want them to understand that the Battle of the Bulge wasn't won at Bastogne, though those men were heroes. It was won on the Red Ball Express. It was won in the oil fields and refineries. It was won by abundance. And I want them to know that black men, segregated, discriminated against, denied recognition, were at the heart of that abundance. We drove the trucks. We delivered the fuel. We made victory possible. They left us out of the history books. They didn't make movies about us. But we were there. We did the job. And Germany's empty tanks are our monument. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine, and if you've got your own story to tell, you can simply send it to the channel in email. Maybe next time we'll be sharing your story.